Lincoln. I am the community organizer of Jews for a Secular Democracy. I really appreciate all of y'all registering for and joining us on this webinar tonight to learn about advocating for the rights of immigrants and refugees. Our speaker tonight for this presentation will be Eddie Chavez Calderon, who's the campaign manager of Arizona Jews for Justice. He has been involved in social justice work and progressive advocacy for many, many years, not just immigrants' rights and the issues of the Latino community, but also LGBTQ acceptance, women's rights, economic justice, workers' rights, voting equality, and civic engagement, and so much more. We're absolutely thrilled to have him. Can't wait to hear what he has to say. And of course, we will have an opportunity for questions at the end. So with that, over to you, Eddie.
Shalom, everybody. Hello. I hope everybody's having a great day. I hope that you're staying safe during these tough times. Again, my name is Eddie Chavez Calderon, and I have multiple hats. I have the amazing ability to work for Arizona Jews for Justice, as well as Uriel Tzedek, which is our Orthodox social justice organization that I'm able to partake and lead with Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, who's my personal great mentor and friend, who we're blessed to work together. And thank you for having me here today. This is such a great event to be able to talk about and advocate, especially when we're thinking about high holidays and kind of going into high holidays and what that looks like, and really bringing in a deep issue that I think for Judaism should be one of those very top social justice issues that hits close to home. So I want to start off a little bit about me and who I am, because y'all are probably wondering, so like, why is this person speaking here, right? So my journey starts as a 4-year-old little boy when I first entered the United States. My first welcome to the United States was behind a Border Patrol agent's car. It was me and my mom, my single mom, who crossed the desert with me on her back. For days and days we walked until we had no opportunity to walk anymore. We were apprehended by Border Patrol. But by this time, I remember that it was the first time that I ever saw my mom cry. It was the first time throughout the entire day that I remember seeing my mom cry, and she turned around and looked at me and said in Spanish, "Vamos a estar bien," which translates, "We're gonna be okay." But as I saw her face ball up, I remember why she cried. My mother asked the Border Patrol agent for a very simple thing. She said, "Sir, we're hungry and we're dehydrated. Can you have anything to spare?" Not for me, for my kid. Border Patrol laughed and threw a pack of saltine crackers at us. That was when my mother broke down. That was the first time throughout our entire migrant journey my mother broke down. By the grace of God, we were able to be released. We were able to have our shot at the American dream, but we knew that it wasn't as easy as people made it out to be. It had extreme challenges. Living undocumented throughout my entire existence has been extremely difficult and has ironed out my own resiliency of knowing that no matter what happens, that I'm going to continue to fight, because I'm fighting back against systems that are so broken from such a long period of time that I'm fighting back against these horrible, horrible placements that have just been barely touched into. Our immigration policies have had no real revamp in a long time, right? So I have always had to have that in the back of my mind and understand that it was so much bigger than me in this fight. Sorry. In this fight, and understanding where my place was. And while I was always trying to partake in being American, because I believed in the dream, I believed in wanting to pursue my happiness and wanting to be anybody that I could be in the United States had a funny way of reminding me that I was an other. When I first started prepping and enjoying high school and figuring out myself, and like all my high school friends enjoying the possibility of freedom and having the ability to leave campus and have a car and hang out with my friends, I knew that I couldn't do that because I couldn't get a license. So I had to lie to my friends and tell them that I failed my license test, that I failed it so many times that I couldn't get it. Because I'd rather lie to people and tell them that I did not have a license because I failed it than I did to the fact saying that I was undocumented. And that to us was the reality that hundreds of thousands of undocumented folks have to deal with. The consistent reminder that we are othered here, that we're not welcomed here. From there, I thought I was doing all right. I was like, you know what? I can't get a license, but I'm going to be good. I'm going to continue to fight, get good grades. And then what happened? College applications came in. And while all my friends were getting excited to fill out FAFSA, I couldn't. Because I didn't have a social security. Because I was othered. So this is where we push towards our advocacy of why it is that we have to advocate for these systems that have been so broken for such a long time. And this is where I go into my Jewish spiritual journey, which I've had the amazing capacity of engaging in my conversion with Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz and understanding that I've always felt a Jewish spirit within me and the spirit of resiliency and understanding that no matter what comes at me, I'm going to be able to overcome it. And this is where we come into a little bit of Torah learning and how we feel that. What is it that fuels us as Jews to act up towards advocating for our immigrant sisters and brothers and our immigrant folks? What is it that we can do, and why is it that we should advocate? It's such a big picture, especially right now, where we have seen that the rise in the anti-immigrant rhetoric is so high. And while we're thinking that sometimes we stay in a communal stance and we stay in a one-lane stance where we think, okay, well, let's fight against anti-Semitism, and we stay there. But it's so much more, because every system of oppression is connected. Everything is cyclical, because the same system of white supremacy that fuels anti-Semitism is the same one that fuels anti-immigrant rhetoric. So once again, what does Torah tell us? How are we treating strangers? Now, we must think about this from an outside point of view. And we see that in the Vayikra, where it says, "The land should not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are foreigners and temporary dwellers within me." Now, Hashem and their stories teaches us that what if we're not even, we're strangers in a broader concept, in his creation, in the creation of what we see. So how do we take a step back and talk about being strangers? How would we treat each other if we were strangers? Would we treat each other with open arms? Would we attack each other? Would we have that fear of engagement? Where does that all go? And we've seen right now in the uproar, we were able to be blessed with the ability to help over 40,000 people collectively, working with other organizations. Early Tzedek and Arizona Jews for Justice is blessed to be able to help over 40,000 asylum seekers who are seeking just a better shot at life, that any single one of us would actively fight to have, that any of us would have any sort of shot of saying, you know what, my life is threatened, I have no economic gain, I must do something to better myself. Anybody would reasonably do it. And obviously we know in Torah and in talking about the Shemot, where we see very, very, very clear what our instructions are. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feeling of being a stranger, having yourself been strangers in the land of Egypt, of knowing what it feels to be demonized, of knowing what it feels to be othered, of knowing what it feels not to be accepted. So now, as Jews in America, we have a weird relationship with power, where some of us have the privilege of documentation and the access to being able to have everything and all the privileges that come with citizenship and documentation, the ability to vote, the ability to have government benefits, the ability to partake day-to-day lives without having any sort of fear of repercussions or not knowing if you're going to be deported and leaving your family forever. So it's easy to forget where our history and our past and what that all has been and our texts and what they show us. We must remind ourselves, go back into that feeling of knowing what our people went through in Egypt and using that to fuel us, to advocate for the folks who are going through that right now, for the folks who are seeking refuge, for the folks who are seeking a better life. We must be bold on our advocacy. And we all know, we've seen what happens, and it's a very scary time right now to think about what is happening in our society. If we look back on what happened with Sodom, and we see how folks were turning away and hurting people and committing all sorts of atrocities, where we see that folks were getting beaten for simply feeding the homeless and the needy. We must reflect, is that where we're at now? Where do we go? Who are we? We need to take this time to self-reflect and truly come out and fight back against the injustices that we see. I want to read a quote that really ignites my passion, and really it keeps me going. And this is by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And he says, "The stranger is indomitable. He may lose a battle, yet never has lost a war. He will never reconcile with the political subjection. Roaming, wandering, he will escape persecution and oppression. When the need arises, the nomad stands up and fights for his freedom, and many a time proves superior in battle against the settled king." Abraham's heroism on the battlefield is the best illustration of this. And it's very difficult because now we think about, well, there's so much going on with the world. There's a pandemic. There's a new thing that we wake up. Sometimes we wake up to a new tweet that we think, well, what do we fight against to now? We feel tired. Some of us may even feel like Jonah. Some of us may feel like, I don't want to fight back against this. It's not my calling. I don't want to do this right now, which is a completely active human trait, right? I myself relate to Jonah so much where sometimes I'm like, you know what? I don't have the energy. I'm just like, I'm not wanting to. But every time I feel that way, I look back. I look back at my mom, who's still not tired, who's still advocating, who's still working, who's still actively trying to better her community, herself, and her family, who's still actively fighting for that American dream, because it's an ongoing dream. Because what we thought was a dream, for a lot of folks, it was a nightmare. It was a false sense of something that was just wrong. That it came in with so much racism, with so much bigotry, with so much at hand that was against us. But yet we prevailed, yet we're here, yet we continue to bring in our resiliency. And this goes to show what we can do and what we will do, right? So please, folks, bring in some questions. I would love to talk about, what can we do right now? What is the best steps to take to advocate for asylum seekers, for DACA recipients, for undocumented folks? What can we do right now during an age where everything seems kind of wonky? Everything seems kind of reversed. What's our next steps? So please, I'm open to some questions and discussions. Let's open it up. Let's have uncomfortable conversations. Ask those questions where you feel like, maybe I didn't want to ask that. Now is the time. Let's engage in good dialogue.
We have one from Richard that I'll ask you, and I suspect I know how you're going to answer this, but I would love to hear. He asked, shouldn't all of those evangelicals who claim that our government should follow biblical teaching therefore be standing at the border welcoming immigrants? And the short answer to that is probably yes. So then I'll elaborate on it. How would you suggest that we have those conversations with folks trying to relate, as you've just done, other faith traditions to these real practical issues that demand action today?
We need to listen to stories. We need to share stories that draw on our heartstrings. Something that you feel like, oh man, I heard Eddie's story, and suddenly that word illegal doesn't correlate with the story that he was sharing. Suddenly that number of hundreds of criminals coming in suddenly doesn't add up. Suddenly I care. I care about this individual. it hurts me to see all the anti-immigrant policies. When we see folks who preach of love, preach of acceptance, preach of bringing in everybody and diversity, yet turn their backs on those who ask for the most amount of help. To me, I see it as a point of growth. We can vilify them all we want, but what is the barrier that you break into bringing in growth? Education has to be key. Tough dialogue has to happen. And it isn't, I think that so many folks say, well, let's have these tough conversations, right? But then we don't have them because we're nervous and it doesn't feel right and you feel icky and you're trying to have these internal battles and you're like, well, you're a racist, and it all becomes personal instead of talking back and listening. Well, let me hear what you have to say. Okay, here's where I hear from you, and here's how I talk about it. When I talk to really right-wing folks who want nothing to do with me, right? They'll talk to me and they'll be like, you know what? Well, I want you out of my country because of these policies, these policies, and these policies. And I'll say, you know what? Perhaps you want me out, but I'm gonna let you know that the immigration policies have been broken systematically for over and over and over by both administrations, by both parties that have affected my community. Suddenly, I somehow met in the middle with them. They somehow agreed with me that yes, both parties have a very broken immigration system, where one of those parties may be a little bit more vicious, and a little bit, I mean a lot more vicious and vocal on how it attacks immigrant communities. Others have done it under the table. And it's important that we have these conversations, even with our evangelical folks who may have a twisted idea of what's going on. But it all has to come through education and having communication with each other.
I love what you said about educating and storytelling. And I think, on a related note to that, a lot of us in the Jewish community are not far removed, our families far removed from having their own issues getting into the United States as refugees and immigrants from Europe who were turned away too often. And so I think even for those of us who do not know somebody like you, who doesn't have this story of what's going on right now, when we oftentimes think of the immigration humanitarian crisis that exists, we have those stories in our own family ancestries that we can pull on as well. I want to ask you a question about taking action, and I guess I'll kind of ask it in two parts. One of them being, how do you recommend that JFASD supporters, our volunteers, people who want to take action on these issues, get to work on the policy side of things? Obviously, DACA is, well, just narrowly survived at the Supreme Court and is still in a lot of danger. And there's so much more work to be done in terms of overhauling our immigration system. But then on the other hand, beyond the policy conversation, directly, is there a way that we can be helping undocumented immigrants, people who are trying to make a living for themselves in this country, refugees? I'm not talking lobbying and calling our members of Congress. I'm talking direct.
Most definitely. That's a great question. And we see that a lot where folks are saying, well, what can we do here? What can we do here locally? And I see that we're here talking about, like, what is it that we're talking about, right? Like, what is DACA? What is an asylum seeker? What does undocumented mean? So folks, DACA, before I really reach into where is the direct advocacy, DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was granted during the Obama administration, that it used to give every 2 years permission to legally work within the United States and not have repercussion of deportation, have access to a Social Security, have access to being able to go to school without any fear, having access to build your own business, to be as normal as possible. And we've seen that the current administration has been very vocal on challenging it and terminating it. I was one of the folks who were able to partake outside of the Supreme Court when the first argument was heard. And I was blessed enough to be in a community where folks heard and came together and prayed and waited for a good outcome for DACA. And we see that now, like, what's the direct action, right? We see that in our government, we have the Dream and Promise Act, where historically it passed in the House. But we know that because of the current folks that are on our office, we know that that's going to die, that it was going to die in the Senate, that it was not even going to get a chance. So we have to think about, and when we're looking at an election cycle, we have to focus on other elections as well, that it can't just be the presidential race. We have to focus at the Senate race as well, our House races, our local races, and focus on those. But now looking back on how to directly help impacted folks, wherever you are, there's a community organization that its involvement is strictly to help those mostly affected. In Arizona, we have a great coalition called the Arizona Dream Act Coalition that looks to specifically help out DACA recipients. At a large, we have organizations like United We Dream, who advocate consistently for folks who are undocumented, documented, asylum seekers, you name it. Look in locally, see who, look up and see who is actively helping folks. If you have the monetary ability, help somebody fill out their DACA and help them pay for their DACA renewals, because they're not cheap. They're around $500. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't just have $500 that I'm gladly able just to throw away. It takes a lot. So these are some ways that you can advocate as well for folks who are in direct need. Volunteer with organizations who are providing food boxes and food banks for the undocumented community. It may be that spending 1 hour of your time packaging up food and getting it ready could save a life.
I think that's right in the spirit of Jewish service and Tikkun Olam, and what we should be encouraging all of us to be doing, including congregationally. It's I think, a great opportunity once people can congregate in groups again for group service, is to stand with the communities that are facing challenges just like those that we faced decades ago. I want to ask you a question, since you mentioned elections, about how we keep the focus on these issues if, as I sure hope happens, speaking just personally as an individual here, we don't have another term of the current president coming up and we have a more progressive administration. You know, I think for a lot of people, it'll be a sigh of relief. But as I'm sure you know, and maybe some other folks on this call know, previous administrations have not done nearly enough. You know, you probably know the statistics better than I do on the Barack Obama administration and deportations. And yet these issues aren't going anywhere. And yet it's so easy to forget about them when it's not this vicious, vicious attack every day from the White House. So how can we all keep the focus on these issues and continue reminding people that there's work to be done, even if the inhumanity that's going on is a little bit more subtle and less visible?
Right, and these attacks are continuous and have never stopped, right? And like you were saying, the Obama administration deported more people than any other sitting president. And that's a reality that we have to face with, right? But we also know that our advocacy doesn't stop regardless of the administration, because just as much as we press this one, if it were to change, we're going to press the other one, because we have to break down years and years of systemic broken systems that just have never been touched and dealt with. We always talk about immigration reform and trying to bring in something new, but where has that been? It hasn't come in from either one of the parties. So our advocacy has to stay consistently strong. Right now, we see that ICE is placing children in hotel rooms and deporting them by themselves. This is a thing that's happening right now. Not yesterday, not in 2011. This is happening right now. Under our feet, it's happening. Children are still being separated. Families are still being torn away. And I see a question that says, how do we build a movement? How do we advocate like that? It has to be through communal pressure. It has to be through us holding together power and building that power of saying, you know what? Here's a group of 15 volunteers who are going to be making calls and are going to be advocating and raising some funds to fill out some DACA recipients renewals, to fill out some forms to help some folks out, and to keep it growing, keep the pressure on, having the dialogue with your friends here and there, and then educating folks on their civic engagement. If you're going to vote, have a conscious vote of what you're voting for, and understand that for me, decisions are made regardless, because I have no access to it. Somebody makes the decisions for me. but y'all who have the ability to vote have access to be able to be our voices, to be our power, to be our wings, to be our movement on paper and in an election.
Fantastic. I want to switch gears a little bit. As you know, the mission of Jews for a Secular Democracy, this initiative, is to protect our secular government, keep religion out of government, and ensure freedom of religion and freedom from religion. We've talked a lot tonight about how faith traditions should be leading people toward welcoming immigrants and welcoming refugees. But I'm curious, as someone who has been so involved in this movement and this advocacy, have you ever seen the opposite take place? Have you seen where we might expect far-right evangelical groups to be weaponizing their faiths to try and deny rights to immigrants and refugees, claiming that there is some biblical or other faith-based motivation for turning folks away?
Most definitely. And we see that with hyper-evangelical radical groups, right? That hide and try to look at some text and try to read it literally, and use that in an attack to justify their willful ignorance and justify their bigotry. And we've seen them do that. And in a sense, we see that happen in the way that it's being used to justify the cruelty that we see within our administrations who have children in cages. And we see that family separation is getting, the name of religion and faith is getting tarnished. It's getting mucked up as it's used to cover up these horrible policies. We can talk about ideology and faith and all day long and talk about the differences, and we can talk about pluralism and acceptance, and we can talk about that. But when it comes down to morals and democracy, there is no moral background. There is nothing that me and you can talk about where we don't meet, where I cannot say, I hear you on that. There isn't. And that's where we see, you cannot come at me and try to justify putting a child in a cage, justify separating a little boy from his mother for the simple act of breaking the law of this law that says that they couldn't come here to make themselves a better life.
Thank you. I think one of the particularly insidious acts that we've seen recently in trying to suppress the power of immigrant communities has been the whole census debacle, with the long-term attempts to put a citizenship question on the census, and now this 30-day shortening of the census response collection period. I'm from Houston, Texas, obviously a very diverse city, as are most large cities in America, but one in particular here where we're having serious issues in terms of folks not responding to the census. We might have a very serious undercount, which harms all of us in this city, but will especially harm the underprivileged immigrant communities that are going to be denied federal funding for schools, for housing, for healthcare, and potentially denied congressional representation. And this, to me, I think, is a very important issue that requires urgent action because of how little time remaining we have to try and boost census responses, especially among immigrant communities. Is there anything that we can be doing today as activists to try and get those numbers up?
Oh yeah, that's such a great question. It's funny, I actually had a census event with one of my great friends today where we talked exactly about this same question, where we see that this is being used as a way to scaring folks, of a way to keeping down people and keeping us oppressed and quiet and in line. But I see it this way. Being counted is an act of resiliency. It's putting a drop in the bucket of building our roads and our roadblocks of a foreseeable future of where our communities are balanced and our communities are funded. And we see that programs that help all of us have accurate funding that benefits our entire community. So the fact that folks want to take that away from you and try to bring in fear tactics is the ugliness of what we see is happening right now. But in our community, how we can stand up is how we can volunteer with organizations that are actively working on this. Volunteer for the census, send in texts, do temperature checks with your friends. Have you filled out your census? Do you know how to fill it out? What are your questions? Let me help you out. Let's call the phone number. There's a very clear phone number in Spanish and a very clear phone number in English that can help you step by step by step. We have to focus on educating our community and letting them know how important the census is and talking about the benefits of the census. Because I think folks need to truly hear and see that and see how much benefits come from this. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, and today we were talking about how averagely one miscount can cost up to $3,000 for one miscount. And if you were to think about bigger picture, if you were to group a potential group of people, that's up to $3 million that are lost in funding that can go right back into our communities, to build better community centers, to fund our libraries, to fund our students, our retirement homes, and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I would like to remind all of the participants on this call, if you have questions, please send them in the Q&A or the chat. Otherwise, I'd love to hear from you, Eddie, just to kind of wrap up the activism side of things. What are the most important things that all of us can take away going forward? What are the organizations we should get plugged into? What's your pitch for us?
Right now, it's vital that we show support to our undocumented community. It's vital that we advocate consistently with folks who agree with us and with folks who don't necessarily agree with us. Keeping the conversation going and making sure that it's on the top of our mind. Understanding that folks are still going through the struggle, that this hasn't stopped, that the attacks are continuous. Lending a hand. Right now, I know that it's so difficult to be able to be in person as we're trying to stay safe and protect our families, ourselves, and our livelihoods. But there's so much we can do online. We can make calls, we can send texts, we can, if we have the financial privileges, we can donate to organizations that directly help undocumented folks, documented folks, and asylum seekers. We can donate to organizations like United with Dream, or who work across the country. I would say focus on finding out what are your organizations within your own state where you live. I know there's plenty that are all over the place. Volunteer for a phone bank, volunteer for a texting party, check in on your friends, ask if they have heard a story of an immigrant, ask where they're coming from. Have these tough conversations. More than anything, I think one of the best when we talk about what is a Jewish what is one of our Jewish values that's more important, right? And me and myself and Rabbi Shmuley were talking about this, and he mentioned a famous rabbi that I can't recall right now, but he said that rabbi talked about that the most important thing, a Jewish value, was consistency. Consistency in ourselves, consistency in our practice, consistency in our advocacy. The consistency is what brings solidness and wholesomeness and power to our advocacy.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's just been fantastic to hear from you. Your story is so intense, but really, really important to hear. Paul, anything you want?
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions.
Right.
So, but thank you so much. And I really appreciate how much passion you bring to it. And it's obvious that it's personal. And, you know, so as someone who also works in nonprofit and brings the personal to the work, I totally understand and appreciate it. And hi for the folks who are watching who I just blooped into this conversation, but I'm Paul Golin. I work at Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Jews for Secular Democracy is our pluralistic social justice initiative. And we very much see immigration policy and refugee issues relating to the separation of church and state in a number of ways. And perhaps the most obvious was when there was literally a Muslim ban, and it was called a Muslim ban, and you can't get more focused on religious persecution than a policy that's called a Muslim ban. And it was thankfully ruled unconstitutional, but they didn't give up. They didn't say, okay, you know, we're going to go home now. So for me, one of the challenges in advocating for immigration rights and refugee rights is the kind of reaction that folks on the other side may have. For example, that we just want to throw open the borders and let everybody come. And before we get into like the fear that that statement actually represents, what is your vision for fair and equitable immigration policy in America? Do you have like a talking point that we can use to kind of describe what it would look like if we did have that in place?
Most definitely, and I think that's one of the hardest conversations that's always brought up, right? It's like everybody's always like, well, we have to do this, and we have to abolish this, and we have to shut down this, but what's the solution, right? And I think that both parties don't know what the solution is. If you were to talk to some folks who are super right wing, they may give you a blatant raw answer and say, we'll build a wall and don't let anybody in, right? But what else? Like, what about the folks who are here? There's so much context to digest and break down. The thing is, we need immigration, comprehensive immigration reform that works for everybody, in a way where folks have access, that's equitable access to being able to have a bridge and a pathway to citizenship. Right now, as a DACA recipient, I have 0 ways to become a citizen. I always get, well, why don't you become a citizen? Marry somebody, hire a lawyer, which in reality, there isn't a pathway to citizenship for me. There doesn't exist. The fact is that there isn't a system in place for comprehensive immigration. There just doesn't exist. So we have to create it. We have to advocate for it. So the answer to you is we have to build that answer. And we are currently pushing for building that answer with the Dream and Promise Act that we're looking to try to pass into legislation. The answer is a building block of things that are getting added into it because we've never had access to being able to build that power. It's never been granted to us. So it's an ongoing thing. And I saw in the chat that somebody was talking about the issues that are out of the country that cause migration. We see that these things are happening from it's all systems that are connected to each other, right? We saw that in the crisis from our Southern American friends. I would ask folks why they were coming here, and they said that they were making no money because the crops that they were used to growing now don't have access to being able to grow because of the growing problem with climate. And we see that climate change is affecting the economy. We see the rise in violence. And now, while I agree, it isn't our job to go and play savior as everybody else. It is our job to have a moral responsibility to help folks who are in need, to provide access and not make it worse for people, where we see that capitalism has torn down different parts of the economies in different countries, right? So at a whole, that my best answer is it's a building answer, right? Our road is being built right now. So while we have some policy in place, we're building off of what we've got, because we've never had the access to be giving the building and the molding blocks to our own policies.
That's a great answer, and I really appreciate particularly the piece about the whole global systems aspect of it. I mean, the long and sordid history of the United States in South America and Latin America is not taught in high school history, that's for sure, but we have used a kind of economic imperialism in our hemisphere that has wrecked countries and kept people in poverty in some ways. And as opposed to saying we on a global level are all in this together, right? And that's just a message that isn't going to fly in America yet. But I think it's the moral message. And I think we have a role in some ways to put that moral message out there. And, you know, I know that in the Jewish social justice world, the phrase about all of us being created in God's image is often used to precursor that kind of thing. And for humanists, I think we would agree with the sentiment, which is that all people are of infinite value, and we are all in this together on this planet together. And but Americans like getting cheap clothing from South Asia. You know, like we have this economic investment in people working for $1 a day in different parts of the globe. And so it becomes really, it's all related, because those people desperately want to get better economic conditions for themselves and their families. So that's all tied in. And of course, and related to that is the criticism or concern that I also hear from the right, or the statements like, we're fine with it as long as they come in legally, right? This is the thing, is like they think that there is a structure, and you're rightfully pointing out there isn't a structure. There's not a structure, but they think that there's laws and that people could come in legally, right? And to me, that always brings back, and Lincoln alluded to it, that my relatives could not come here legally in the 1930s, so they were murdered in Europe, because what was legal was not immigration of Jews from Europe. And so legal doesn't mean moral always, right? And so what do you guys do? I've seen some photos in terms of actual activity and action, because you're on the border. You know, when you guys go to the border, and I think I've seen Shmuley, like he'll bring people. I'm not in a border state. Although we have a border with Canada, but it's less of an issue. But when he brings people to the border, when you guys go down there, what are you seeing, and what kind of actions are you doing?
Most definitely. So what we see is definitely a huge stop and halt to the migration process because of the current administration's drawback on asylum, and the horrible attacks that we have seen on asylum. We have great partners on the other side of the border, of the Nogales side and the Mexican side of Nogales, who let us know every week, like, we're overrun with folks. We need help. And we have so much capabilities to being able to help here. We were angered to hear that ICE is choosing to have third parties set children in hotel rooms, where we know that we have facilities and volunteers who have the capabilities and resources to help folks to do that every day. We have a great partnership with the International Rescue Committee, where they were able to open up a welcome center here that shelters asylum seekers and refugees and undocumented folks. And we're able to provide masks, different kinds of donations. And lately, my favorite thing is providing toys. Providing a little bit of joy to those children who are coming in here, who have been so traumatized by what's been going on, and giving them a little Hot Wheels or a little toy Spider-Man, and watching their self live up and smile and remind themselves that they're a little kid. And that's been such a great joy to us. And we're going to continue to be leading some of the work here and helping some of our immigrant folks who need advocacy right now and need support from the community.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And one of the other thoughts I had, or questions, you know, I think that right now in the Jewish community, there has been certainly a conversation. I don't know whether it's a reckoning around race, and certainly, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has gained momentum this year, and the increasing visibility of Jews of color and non-Ashkenazic Jews. And I've known for many years that this has been in process, and now it's finally getting the kind of attention it deserves. You know, how does race play into this? I've heard from, depressingly, Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union who want to close all immigration. And I think people marched in the streets to bring you here, and now you want to lift up the ladder behind you now that you've made it here. And it's so depressing, but I do know that it represents a segment of the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but think that, as with the evangelical community kind of throwing the love thy neighbor out the window, there's a big undercurrent of race. I mean, it's not an undercurrent when it's flat out said in pretty clear ways by at least, you know, some folks in the administration. And also, of course, you know, one of the architects of this is Stephen Miller, whose grandparents or great-grandparents were also Jewish immigrants and refugees. So how do you you know, how can we better point that out? I mean, people obviously get a little bit defensive when you suggest that they're racist, but, you know, how do we talk about this with people and let them know, you know, that it happened to us. And now that we are white, now that we're accepted, you know, plenty of people are happy to take that privilege and run with it and not turn around and put their hand out to help other people.
That's such a great question and such a great discussion. And this is where one of those contexts, Rabbi Michael Lerner, who wrote a book called Revolutionary Love, he talks about the context of power and how we only punch those who we're comfortable punching. How we only go after those folks who we're comfortable going after, right? Going after immigrants who have no power over you is easy to do. Going after the systems of place and the governments that are upholding is very hard to do. So being able to say, the fault's on you, now I have the privilege and the power, it's easy to do. It's easy to punch up when you're comfortable doing it, right? And to bring along the race thing, we have to understand how cyclical all systems of oppression are. That the same white supremacist tactics and the same systems and rhetoric that runs and is fueled by white supremacy is the same one that attacks anti-Semitism, is the same one that wants children separated from their families, and is the same one that is okay with police murdering Black and brown folks. And we have to come around and have that conversation to show folks that everything is intertwined, that everything is connected. Because I think from a Jewish standpoint, there is so much history of persecution, of hate, of violence, of othering, that we grow a shell of saying, I'm going to be protective and I'm going to just fight for the community that I know and I feel comfortable with, and anything else is scary and I'm not trying to get myself involved in that. But we tend to miss out of what's the reality of everything having a connection to it, right? And I think we're in a unique spot right now where white supremacy has had a very, very distinctive way. And one of my great friends, his name is Ariel, who we partook in a Sela program from Ben the Ark. He talked about how white supremacy has put Jews as gatekeepers in the source of power, of saying, well, you are against the corporations, the Jews are the ones that are the corporations. So then we get attacks from the left and from the right, where we feel like, what do I do? What do I do? I'm trying to advocate here, but I'm getting put in here. But we then have to take, again, a step back and see how everything works and how intertwined it is and how all these systems affect each other, because they are a cancerous system that hides itself and multiplies in everything.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate all that you do, and I hope that we can continue to follow what you're doing and support you and have our folks stay up to date on the things that you're doing and the ways that you can help. And again, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate y'all for having me. Follow Early Tzedek on Facebook. Follow Arizona Jews for Justice on Facebook to stay up to date on all of our work and what we do. And we're just going to continue to fight. Follow us if you want to get involved in that fight and that advocacy, because we have to create our own roads now. It's up to us to be that change. It isn't enough to just sit back and hope that something better comes. We have to be that hope.
Yep. And as I think Lincoln kind of alluded to, even if we have a new administration, which may be obviously more receptive to hearing it, this has not been about who has been in power. This is an ongoing thing. There's work to be done regardless, and the fight is going to continue. So thank you again, and thanks everybody who participated.
Take care.
Bye-bye.